Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Now, are you planning to do any more study? You're a bit done with it.
No, so I'm very keen to get back to my studies next year. I'll be doing a Juris Doctorate, either at UWA or Melbourne Law School. So that's my plan.
Oh, wow. And you're in a recent book. What's the name of that?
So I've recently been published in Marbeti, which is an anthology of poems and prose and short stories from a bunch of young Aboriginal writers that was developed through the orientation program at UWA.
We have a copy of that here, Marbeti, which Elfie was also one of the two editors on, along with Linda Martin. So, Curly, how are you doing?
Oh, hey, Sam. Hi. Did you record on you?
Oh, no, we can't hear you yet.
Oh, can you hear me?
Okay, here we go. I can hear you now. Hey, how you doing?
Hey. Oh, it's so nice to see your beautiful faces. I wish I could be there with you.
Man, I think we're in sync with the earrings. Check it out.
Yeah, these are Nagala Jandu. Anybody who's looking for some good ones, they're up on Yaru country. Yeah, beautiful community.
Oh, really nice. How you doing? Quabadok Nang Kanan Goreng. It's a beautiful day here. The sun is shining. Nan Court Europe and Nunok Jinaning. I'm so happy to see you.
I'm so happy.
Can you tell everyone what you do to keep busy?
Oh, lots of things. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of weaving. I've spent the week making my possum skin cloak with Auntie Loretta Parsley on Yuin country, which is a cultural practice that's being revived. So I'm an artist, I'm a poet, a writer. I also work in consulting, mostly cultural consulting and justice, diversity, equity and inclusion. But outside of that, I love to spend time by the sea, catch up with my family. So yeah, many things. And I guess I know the next question you probably ask might be similar to one that you've asked the other participants. And I loved Marbeti and I loved Homecoming. And a book that I've recently been published in is Borderless, which is a transnational feminist anthology. It's a beautiful collection. It came out not long ago. And Bindi is one of my most recent books. Yeah. And
also Kindred, which I have got here. So Kindred is Curly's poetry anthology of her own work. Thank you for joining us, Curly.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's lovely to be with you all.
All right, Elfie, congratulations on being nominated in the poetry category of the recent Queensland Literary Awards. Homecoming is a stunning book. How would you describe it to someone picking it up for the first time?
I think I would say it's a strange book. It's a strange collection of fragments, perhaps, of stories and memories from 4 generations of Noongar women in my family. And the story, the form of the book, attempts to reflect the experience that I had in looking back along our lineage and trying to recover what had been lost and recovering what really felt like fragments of stories. And so it's a kind of disrupted, disjointed collection of poetry and poetic prose, and it really collapses any sense of time and place. And I think that makes it a difficult read. So I might warn the reader, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I was stunned to read it. The pages of Homecoming include a mix of poetry, prose, art, interviews with family members, and also quotes from the archives. It reads like a considered collection of elements, and the accumulative effect is truth-telling with deep roots, and I think full heart. It's got the best of two approaches of being told a yarn from the heart and being presented with facts and recorded testimonies. It couldn't have been easy to find the balance here and find the right elements to include. Would you be able to talk us through how it started, how you got started on what became Homecoming?
The collection started quite some time ago, around 5 years ago, when I was involved in a research project at the Centre for Human Rights Education at Curtin University here in Perth. And that research project was a gathering of Noongar researchers and community members, and we looked back at what are colonial archives here at the State Records Office in Perth. And my role in that project was to attempt to gather some of the letters that Noongar mums and dads had written when their children had been removed as part of the stolen generations. And so the archive has preserved or captured these letters and these kind of pleas for children to be returned, and they tell a really vivid story of how loved and cared for Noongar children are and how hard their parents fought for them to be returned to them. And in an attempt to share some of that story, I decided to work from the letters that were connected to my own family. So it really tells the stories of my grandmothers and great-grandmothers, who are Wajak and Wilman Noongar women, and how they attempted to hold their families together during this history, and that the archive tells some of that story. Some of that story is also in our family stories and memories, and some of it is just simply from my imagination. And I tried to pull out I guess what I wanted was to share with the reader how that experience felt. So it's not that you might come to know that history in the book, but you might come to feel it. And so it's a book that's full of emotion, and knowledge and fact, particularly in a linear sense, was removed so that we could just sit with the emotions that do exist in the archive and within our families. Yeah.
As someone who looks through the archives, which I understand to be places of violence for Noongar people and Indigenous people around the world to go into the archives and see terrible accounts, but also the pieces that you're looking for. Is there something of Homecoming of creating an archive in the book that contains personal stories, recorded stories, or have you not placed any sort of boundaries on what Homecoming is? Just let it be.
That's a really beautiful question, and perhaps one I don't know the answer to. I would love to think of the book as an archive, but yeah, perhaps it's an archive of emotion more than anything else. That's a really beautiful question, and I might have to think over it. I think one of the things that brought me some joy was that it's difficult for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families to recover our stories that have been lost. And you might know this, Jarrad, in the work that you mentioned that you're involved in now. And I guess I had hoped that work that I had done and that gathering would be something that I could leave for the next generation of my family. So whatever I collected, I think I collected it with my nieces and my nephews in mind. And we have a big digital archive, and the book is like a small sharing of that. And it's something there maybe to guide members of the family that want to look back and learn about that history.
This might be a good time to hear a little bit of Homecoming.
Okay, I've chosen a small section to read. So it's a small part of a small story. And it's a story called Blood Love. And it's about my grandmother, Helen Shiosaki, and her mother, Olive Harris. And it has some Noongar language words in it. It has Walyalup, the Noongar language word for Fremantle, Belia, the word for our river, the Swan River, and Nunk, which is the word for mother or son. Kulang took her first breath of salty air on the veranda of Hillcrest Maternity Hospital in Walyalup. That day, it was too cold to be outside on the veranda. Kulang didn't have a bed, a warm blanket even, but nestled underneath her mother's woolen winter coat, she was lulled into unguarded sleep by the patterned rhythm of Nunk's heartbeat. Hillcrest was a hospital for the newest wards of the state, but Kulang didn't belong there. She belonged to the place where the Belia snaked into the Indian Ocean, where the sun rose over the hills and fell into the water. There, underneath Nunk's coat, Kulang had everything she needed. Nunk love, mother love, blood love.
Thank you so much, Elf. And yeah, I have to say that I've never read anything quite like the format of Homecoming. I think it's a real gift, and it suggests new forms for writing, not just for Indigenous mob, but for people coming to terms with what are the authoritative elements of what we consider, fact and archives and research. Is it the kind of hierarchy has been flattened, I think, in Homecoming, and these pieces are brought together to be considered in their pieces and to be put together by the person reading it. Yeah, thank you so much. Hi, Curly. We still got Curly there. Curly, congratulations for all the awards and nominations for Bindi, most recently the Queensland Literary Awards for Best Children's Novel. And congratulations to Dub Leffler, who illustrated Bindi. So Bindi is told in verse or prose poetry. The poetic form seems central to your narrative style. And you also have a poetry collection, Kindred. So what is it about the poetic form? What does the poetic form offer you? And have you always written in that form?
Thank you, sis. It's been such a special time sitting with poetry and having poetry evolve into so many realms in my world. And I think poetry has always been my chosen form of writing, my place where I start, and then where it ends after that is an unknown thing. I was in high school when I started writing poems, and I didn't realise they were poems until fellow author Yvette Pishoglian pointed it out. She said, "Girls, those are poetry." I'm like, "Oh, but they don't have that rhyme scheme, or they don't sit on the page with this particular form or shape." And she said, "Oh, that's not what a poem is. Go and find out what poems are." And so I went and worked with Red Room Poetry, and Dr. Tamron Bennett there said that we should live our poems, that, poetry is this way of life that we should embody. And so I think since that point, poetry has been something that lives on the page sometimes, and sometimes it's, more performative or spoken. Sometimes it's a verse novel or narrative, and others, at the moment, I'm exploring where poetry intersects with art. So yeah, it's always been an underpinning for my writing. And it's been a beautiful way, I think, to welcome our kids especially into story, because I think we're all poets, aren't we, in the way that we speak and share story. Yeah. And particularly for maybe those less confident readers as well, I think a story with heart that's concise. I find a lot of our kids are gravitating to Bindi, maybe for that reason, that they feel a bit more safe in reading something that they can, that has language in it, that talks about the experiences of growing up in the bush or spending time by the water and being with family. And that speaks with this rhythm that we see in our storytelling traditionally.
Yeah, I was at a session last night for Sidewalks, and Elfie was interviewing Kim Scott, the Noongar novelist. And Kim talked about abiding stories, about stories that live in place and that follow the rhythms of place. So I'm interested to hear you say that the poetic form, with Bindi being told in verse style, is perhaps more inclusive for kids, especially, kids that live in rural areas and even kids in the city who are deeply aware of the rhythms of nature as children are. Their whole world is what's around them and what they can see. As adults, perhaps we become more kind of abstract as we bring other elements into our lives. But that's a bit of a light moment for me to think that poetry could be more inclusive, because do you reckon that poetry as it was taught to us was a bit stuffy and a bit not quite, yeah.
I explain it as being written by dead white guys, which was the poetry that I was raised on. We had Patterson and Wilfred Owen, and don't get me wrong, like that poetry hooked me on poets, and had me really interested in the way that narrative could exist with all of these other beautiful features, and could have melody and rhythm and all of those personified beautiful moments. But I did feel like it didn't involve me, or that it wasn't. It pictured the land as object rather than character. And I think, Gamong Bauri, our Mother Earth, she features so heavily in the writing of First Nations writers, and she's such a big character in my work. She's not a setting, but a character. And I think, poetry allows us to portray maybe that characterization in a different way than we could through prose. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, I think about this sometimes, that like I wrote a novel for my PhD, and I just wonder, this is quite a big, complicated thing. When I write poetry, it's, I don't know, it's not like it's simpler, but it's direct and concise, as you said. So like reading Bindi, and I read Bindi just after my PhD, and I had like nothing left for the world and never wanted to read a book again. And Bindi, I did. I was like, the 8 to 12-year-olds who were the target market, just like, oh, I can read this. I'm getting through a page. Like, I finished a book, after reading, research articles. So there's something wonderful about that we're all a bit time poor as adults, and that we want to read like we did as kids, and the books are shorter, and the beautiful rhythms of Bindi really help be in with the story. So was Bindi's story always going to be verse novel, or did it just kind of happen?
Oh, I think it emerged like that. Yeah, it was originally a really long form poem, and I met with the Magabala team after Bindi won the Daisy Utamara Award. And I sat down with Rachel Binsala, who's just killing it in Black publishing in Australia and the world. And Rach said, Curls, I think this is a verse novel. Poetry is totally a strong set. Let's see if we can take narrative and prose and make something powerful here. And I was guided by Grace Lucas Pennington as well, my editor, who is, an exceptional editor. She does such amazing work here. And I think between both of those, the guidance of both of them, the beauty of Bindi was born.
I was going to ask you to read from Kindred, but I don't know if you've got something you'd like to read from Bindi instead.
Yeah, I mean, I picked out a bunch. I was like, gosh, what am I going to read today? So I have a bunch of books here open up. So hopefully we'll get more than one chance. But actually, I have a poem. I do have some from Bindi, but I'm working on a collection called Returning at the moment, which is about the decolonial self, and returning to, to who we are when we don't have labels or identities slapped upon us, or perceptions of who we are. And I think one thing that's implicit in Bindi and Kindred is this language and this connection to landscape and season, and our caring for those things and the intricacy and our relationships with all of the land at all times. And so if it's okay with what we're talking about, I feel like actually Sundowns and Seasons might be the best poem to read. And it's from this forthcoming collection that I'm creating at the moment. It will be out in the next year or so. So this is written on Dharawal country, with respect for the Dharawal people who have always cared for the land, sea and skies here, and who will. This is the time of lily pillies plumping into fullness, possum skin cloaks on the mend, or perhaps being worn for the first time again. An age of deciduous homemakers losing leaves, and the last flowers falling from frangipani. A moment of wattle and whale sinking to mark the start of migration, and like the old ones, here I am, healing, releasing, growing and moving, fruiting, a new path on this country that is not mine, but who kindly offers wisdoms as trees. Reminds us how our scars can be sacred and the many ways to lay down deep roots to nourishment beneath. Even when the west wind howls and hauls islands into ocean, these wise ones show how a crowded canopy offers shade, but limits growth to those below, knowing that tall trees are forged over grandfather sundowns and seasons, 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 seasons. Thanks, Cass. Yeah, you'd have heard there we have 6 seasons here on WRFW country. And I think there's also a mention of the west wind that howls and hauls the islands into ocean, which is tied to a dreaming story here about the 5 islands dreaming in Mount Gira.
Thanks so much, Curls. And thanks for the hot scoop of the poem in your next collection.
Anything for you, my friend.
Jarrad, you're an emerging poet. How has poetry found its way into your life? Is it something that you've read, or is it something just kind of happened naturally as you began to write?
Yeah, so I think growing up, I didn't really read that much poetry. I guess in school we did read a little bit, but it wasn't something that caught my attention until I started writing. It did come naturally to me. I guess I maybe have a creative flair, I guess, but so yeah, I sort of came to it naturally. And during my time at university doing the orientation course, we sort of did some poetry in a creative writing class, and I just sort of latched onto it, and it was something that I found very natural to do.
Because Ma Biddy, this collection, edited by Elfie Shiosaki and Linda Marson, is the result of creative writing classes for Indigenous students at UWA. How was it going to these classes? Like, if poetry, you learn a bit of poetry in primary school, and as we've covered, it's probably not super relevant to our lives. So was it different to be in a room of other Indigenous students? And were you guys kind of looking at Indigenous poets?
So I guess I sort of want to start off by saying that the bridging course was evolved by sort of allowing Indigenous First Nation students to be able to attend university. And, because university is quite a daunting experience for anyone, let alone First Nations people who have been so oppressed by institutions, having that safe cultural space with other Indigenous students to be able to write our own stories and be able to share what our experiences are and what we want to share. It was very inspirational being in those classes. And yeah, we did learn about a couple of Indigenous poets. I probably can't remember. It was years and years ago now. But yeah, so it was a very inspirational space and a culturally safe space to be able to share our experiences within a creative form.
So did you guys have to do it as part of this bridging course?
Yeah, it was a part of our assessments. Yeah.
Yeah. How did you feel going in compared to coming out?
I don't know. I guess again with that culturally safe space, you just know that no one is there to judge you, and so you don't have those nerves when you're in a room full of non-Indigenous people. So I know when I went back into my first year of my degree, it was quite daunting to be in a room where I was the only Indigenous person. Of course, I grew out of that, but it just brings home the fact that when you're in a space where you can share whatever you want, it's quite inspiring.
So you have 2 poems in Marbeti, one called Stolen and one called Stolen Generation. Would you be open to perhaps reading them for us today?
Just find them. So this first one is called Stolen Generation. If you didn't surpass, you got labelled half-caste. A stolen generation from white man's impregnation. Their melanin just not prevalent, yet its irrelevance evident. Training the black out leaves their lives in doubt. A spectrum of protrusion called for a white man's intrusion. A chemistry of supremacy helping them, allegedly. And so this one is called Stolen. I'm sorry, it was never enough. Our ancestors and grandparents, they are oh so tough. But years ago were taken away by that white man, led my grandfather astray. How did they live in a world so grey, surviving, not thriving, on a mission for change? But why was that a necessity for them? Was it so I did not condemn? But why, I still ask, they were morally bankrupted. I now live my life sorely disgusted.
Thank you so much for sharing that. This might be a bit of a tough question, but as you're at kind of the beginning of your writing journey, it takes people a long time to work out who they think they're writing to. Do you have a sense of that at this point of your journey, if you perhaps write for yourself, or if there's someone out there that you would like to read? What you've written?
Well, I guess in the beginning when I was writing these poems, and there were a series of other poems, but those were the 2 that were chosen for Marbeti. I think it was a period of self-discovery for me. Of course, I knew about the stolen generation and my grandparents being taken away, but to be able to write that down on paper and do some research and come back and be creative with it, it's really helped me to understand the ongoing impacts of that era. So yeah.
So putting it in writing has had an impact on how you feel about yourself?
Yeah, definitely. I think in the beginning, and then compiling it into a book with all of these other First Nations young writers, it's sort of become prevalent that these are stories that can help our younger generation to overcome intergenerational trauma, and maybe even our older people, our elders, to heal some of their past traumas.
Thanks so much, Jarrad. That's great. And the kind of like intergenerational trauma, the things that have been taken away from Indigenous people, one of those things is language. And language is currently in return being revitalised all around the Australian continent and its islands. Elfie, in Homecoming, there is English and Noongar, and there was some Noongar in your reading that you did. What has it been like to include Noongar language in your writing?
That's a really good question. And I just wanted to mention first that I think Jarrad's killing his first writing festival.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And speaking with such heart and elegance. So you're doing a great job, because it's a bit nerve-wracking, isn't it? It's really complicated space to try and write Noongar language on the page and publish it. And I did that with fear and trepidation and with the guidance from Wajak traditional owner Len Collard, because our language is being revitalised, and it's being revitalised with great care. And I yarned with Pop Len because there were parts of my storytelling in Homecoming that I didn't want to be translated into English. There are some kind of heart words in the book, like mother, nunk, that I wanted to use our language for, or kulang, child. And there was a great freedom in that. But it was a kind of, I think Poplen and I talked about a cardigan biddy. It was a learning pathway for me to work with him to find a respectful way to do that. Yeah. And yeah, I found a lot of freedom actually in not having to translate parts of myself. Yeah. That answer the question.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you. Curly, you've also got a couple of languages in poetic form in Kindred. How is it that those languages have found their way into your writing?
Thanks, sis. Yeah, and I echo that, Elfie, back to you, that, you know, there's parts of me I didn't want translated that could only exist in language. Oh, that's so profound and so beautiful. And I agree. I think that's really, really true. And I think that's something that I wanted for in Bindi and in Kindred, was to be able to include language and to give language back to the land and to the people to hold that language and continue that culture and that way of communicating. Arnie Jodie Edwards, whose language work and her research is included in Kindred, said that if we want the land to respond to us, we have to call it by its right name. And so she was a real big inspiration in helping include adalah language in Kindred. And for me, my language journey started on the Shoalhaven River, or Bungai, and I was working with Jacob Morris and Adrian Webster, who teach Gumia Darawal and Jaldeves, 3 young custodians who also do cultural backburning. And they said, like, sis, this is your language too, you know, you get to learn this. And after our workshop, we were standing on the banks of the river, and I heard ancestors speak in language for the first time, like a song. And I called my auntie and said, Auntie, I got these words and I can't understand them. And she said, oh, Barb, that's it. That's your journey. It's time for you to go and learn language. And so I created poetry in first languages with Red Room Poetry, which supported many poets to go and learn their language on their language journey with elders and custodians in their community, and then commission poems in those languages. And it also allowed me to support children to learn language too. So it meant that I had other people to speak in language with, which is such a beautiful thing to be able to do. And I guess writing poems was a practice for me, that process of putting the words down so that I can hold them, and like I've got somewhere to echo them, somewhere for them to bounce back to me when I need them again, but also for other people to pick them up and try them on with their mouth so that they're continuing out in the world some other way. Because I think when we stop speaking them, we lose it. And our languages have been carried in so many beautiful ways, songs, stories, those yarns that our old people had under card tables on missions, you know, kids sitting underneath their feet. But what's the word for this? I'm just constantly astounded that our language has been held and kept alive through such dying, you know, just through such trying circumstances that we've all been through. And I think it's a real honour to be able to include them in the written word, and to do so by honouring those elders and custodians who have taught us those words. So yeah, thank you, Ani Jody, for helping me with Darawal, Trish Levitt and Ani Valmamoke for the Ganagara language that I can speak. Yeah, and there's many, many more as well as I continue to learn my journey.
Now that I think of it, Bindi has got language words in it that are untranslated. And through context, you kind of work out what they mean. And I think that shows a real, like it's generosity to share those words, but also a trust in a reader, especially a young reader. and the same in Homecoming, that the reader will understand what that means, you know, that you don't have to put the translation right at the bottom, that it's like, no, you know, we are people who speak English and our ancestral language, and perhaps the languages of our, you know, territorial neighbours. We don't necessarily have to constantly be translating, like, you know, people who don't speak the Indigenous language can sit and listen and learn, which is the way that you would learn language generally. So Bindi really does have that, that trust.
I was afraid of othering our language, which I think has been historically done in publishing. You know, there's a footnote at the bottom, or the translation in parentheses, and and there's definitely times where maybe there might only be one or two words in a poem, and then I would include that translation with that footnote. But yeah, I wanted to make sure that our language words were contextual, were used as if we were just speaking them every day, to try and encourage people to do that. But also with that trust and that repetition that you're going to speak this word and learn this word by the end of this book. You know, you're going to know the word for karat, for rain, can be for fire, naora, for that beautiful bird there, or garrow, that black cockatoo. It is such an integral part of the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Jarrad, what does this language conversation make you think of at the beginning of your writing journey?
Yeah, well, I think for me it's quite difficult. I think we all know, with the ongoing impacts of intergenerational trauma and cultural genocide, it's definitely hard for some Aboriginal cultures to regain their language, especially with the stolen generation having families being separated so far apart. You know, WA is a big state, Australia is a big country. It's very hard to find your way back home if you were a part of the stolen generations and are a descendant of the stolen generations. So for me, you know, living off country, having my grandfather not know his language because he was taken away, it's, you know, it's very hard for me to sort of go back and find and learn about my culture and my language. So I think it just goes to show what impact colonisation has had on this country and to our people.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've got a minute or two left. I would like to ask each of the panellists just one question. The theme of the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival this year is self-reflection. Elfie, does self-reflection bring up anything for you?
It should do, yes. Jarrad told me his thoughts on this before, and I want to copy them, but he said I'm not allowed to. Should do. Just perhaps what I would offer in this space, we're discussing First Nations poetry, is just the depth of generosity that I see in First Nations poetry, whether it's in works that has been published or in the spaces where we are developing our work. I think there is this huge well source underneath the publications that you see, and it's how First Nations people are gathering and developing our work in collaborative ways, much like the writing spaces you were talking about, Jarrad. And I think there's this depth of generosity and an invitation to us. I love reading First Nations poetry as well as writing it, but that invitation to sit and listen with the words, to sit and listen with a culture that's not your own, because so much of other First Nations poetry is not my culture, it's from another nation around Australia or overseas. And I think that's a bit of a gift, that self-reflection that is offered on the pages, that vulnerability, that warmth, and that invitation to give full empathy and to see how other people see the world. And it's made me think that self-reflection is really a collective practice for us, that when we do that, we share our how we're feeling and how we're thinking and writing, that's actually a collective process that we can all participate in. And So yeah, perhaps that's a messy way of answering the question, but that self-reflection is really something that we do together as a community. Yeah.
Thank you. Curly, self-reflection, what do you reckon?
Oh my gosh, Elfie, like the sooner that you're the Prime Minister or when we get treaty, whatever that looks like can you just lead us and just give us these little doses of wisdom? And you too, Jarrad. Gosh,
Jarrad's going to be the next Prime Minister.
Perfect. I've been sitting here weaving while we've been yarning, and I've just got that. I echo that totally. That it is this collective practice. And I think poetry so often is a moment of self-reflection for me. It's a moment to pause, come back to what is true and what is old and what is known and the places where we're remembered. And I think in being in relation with those places where we're remembered, in kinship, in family, in culture, in language, in land, our ancestry, there is also remembering. And so I think for me, self-reflection is that process of remembering. Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I'll speak for you. No. So I think that when we're you need to self-reflect in order to grow. And I think what these books do, at least my book, I don't want to speak for everyone else, but what Aboriginal writing does is it allows wider Australia to have us to self-reflect on our past as a collective nation. It allows for truth-telling. All of our stories are about truth-telling. And so I think in order for Australia to grow and really accept us as a people, which has come leaps and bounds since colonial times, I think it just, these books allow us to grow. Yeah.
Yeah, and tell our own stories.
Yeah.
You know, truth-telling in poetry really comes through in all of these collections. And I thank you guys. Thank you, Jarrad. Thank you, Elfie. Thank you, Curls. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for sharing this space with us today. Thank you.